Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova. 2 weeks ago, as I was writing my remarks for this first morning of Rosh Hashanah, I got an email from the guy that we hired to record some of the videos that you are seeing, that you are watching for the high holidays, saying that 50% of what we had recorded was completely gone. His hard drive crashed, so everything was all of a sudden lost. Boom. I remember then that when I read that email, a couple of thoughts crossed my mind. The first one was, oh man, this is so 2020. I hate you, 2020. The second was, well, this might give me what I was looking for to write a sermon for the first morning of Rosh Hashanah. That's nice. The third thought was, but I finished writing a sermon for the first morning of Rosh Hashanah only a few minutes ago. This is so unfair. I hate you, 2020. Just get out of here. Just get out. Well, as you can see, or as you are going to be able to see, I scrapped whatever I had written for today and started with a new sermon all over again. And here are the results of that. These past few months have been for many of us the most disruptive time in our lives. Many have lost their jobs, and many others have experienced the loss of income. Some have tested positive for COVID-19, and some had to figure out how to be there for those in their homes struggling with the virus. We have experienced a lot of pain. Many of us have felt deeply alone. We have become fearful of those who are not part of our immediate families. And I am sure that most of us have snapped in anger as people who actually we like for all sorts of reasons, and not all of them reasonable or easy to understand. Those of us who are parents are exhausted. On the one hand, some of our children are attending school in person, and we have to deal with the anxiety of them catching the bug every single day. On the other hand, some of our children are still on remote learning mode, and we have to deal with the potential repercussions of them having all their social interactions mediated through their smartphones or any other available screen. These past few months have disrupted our lives in such a way that we don't know when we are going to feel comfortable enough to hug one another. We don't know when we are going to let our friends back into our homes. And we are not even sure if we will be fine shaking the hands of people around us ever again. We are walking a very fine line here between taking healthy measures to protect ourselves and our dear ones, and being caught by an overwhelming fear that pushes us to stay safe and secure through the building of thick walls, through the keeping of strangers away, and through the ongoing state of suspicion towards everyone who doesn't look like us, think like us, or behave like us. When I think about the tensions between the coronavirus and the individual freedoms, I cannot help but remember that the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari already warned us that in the big battle between health and privacy, health is likely to win hands down. And as I reflect on the ongoing clash between mass surveillance and personal autonomy, I also recall that the South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han has already told us that COVID-19 is not conducive to democracy because fear is the cradle of autocracy. In our days, it is fairly easy to be afraid of fear itself. But then, when struck by worries and anxieties, I find myself thinking about Master Yoda's wisdom in general, and especially about the advice that he gave to a young Anakin when he said, "Fear is the path to the dark side, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering." If Yoda is right, and I obviously think he is, then the first step we need to take is to recognize our fears and to see if we can find a couple of antidotes that will help us heal in the midst of so much uncertainty and chaos. I've been thinking quite a bit about these potential cures. Not for COVID-19, sorry, but that is way beyond my pay grade, but for the collateral damage that the virus has brought upon us. So today, let me introduce you to what I would like to call the 4 P words, antidotes to our troubling times. So, the first one of these P word antidotes is patience. The more I think about it, the clearer it is to me that one of the biggest problems of our days, with or without the coronavirus, is our complete lack of patience. In a world that is continuously accelerating, we are losing the ability to wait. We want instant solutions to whatever is troubling us, and we refuse to accept that certain processes may require some time to bear fruits. We want it all, and we want it now. We are so desperate for magic formulas that some of us may be ready to drink bleach to get rid of the virus, and many others won't linger too long before rushing to the bathroom cabinet in search of some pain medicine that will get them a chemical release from the twinges or aches that they may be experiencing at any given moment. We live rushing from one place to the other. We are afraid of losing any time without necessarily having a clear idea of what we want to accomplish during those moments. As Rabbi Nilton Bonder likes to say, we dream about living lives of 100 years, and yet we don't know what to do with ourselves on a Sunday afternoon. It seems as if our addiction to running full schedules is just the way we have found to avoid asking ourselves how to make the best use of our time here on earth. We want to control time, but time, as author Amy Fusselman reminds us, like most things that are magical and wild inside us, time cannot be reduced to something small, uncontrollable outside us. Now that the pandemic has upset the rhythms of our lives, now that we were pushed to slow down and think, now we have to figure out what to do with our time as we try to realign the way we live with the way we think about our priorities, our aspirations, and our hopes. In his book, A Geography of Time, the American psychologist Robert Levine wrote that in some cultures, doing nothing is highly treasured. It is not seen as merely a break in the action, but as a productive and creative force. It might well be that, especially in our days, we need to change our approach to time by nurturing a renewed sense of patience. Perhaps we should begin by doing what Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Satanov did when he defined patience as when something bad happens to you and you did not have the power to avoid it, do not aggravate the situation even more through wasted grief. If we follow in the rabbi's footsteps, then we may realize that patience is deeply connected to the second of the P word antidotes that I wanted to share with you today, and that word is perspective. When I talk about perspective, I'm talking about putting our pain in context. When I learned that half of our recordings for the high holidays were gone, I was speechless. I was angry, frustrated, mentally depleted. It was tough. But later that day, that very same day, I learned about someone who had lost his 35-year-old brother to an overdose. And I also heard about another person in his late 50s, completely fit and full of life, who had a deadly heart attack. And you know what? The recordings we lost created some real sorrow. But there was a fairly easy way to replace them. For those who lost their relatives, there was no way to bring them back. So my point here is not to deny our pain, not at all. But as we go through our own frustrations in these challenging times, we should try to zoom out, even if for a bit, if only to discover that some of our sorrows are minor in comparison to what other folks around us are going through at any given moment. In our congregation, we have members who have survived the Shoah, and we have members who have lost part of their families during the Shoah. We have people who have fought in Vietnam. We have people who have fought in the Yom Kippur War in Israel. We have people who have recovered from cancer, and we also have people who are taking care right now of relatives dealing with really tough medical conditions. If you stop for a moment, you will see that there is no shortage of pain and despair, even among those closest to us, even if we don't always see it. And that is part of the problem. Because when we are suffering, it usually doesn't matter to us if someone else is struggling with a major illness or just lost a dear one. Pain, fear, and anger affect our ability to empathize with others. They push us to think only about ourselves and to forget about the rest. And that is exactly why we need to develop a wider perspective, trying to be kind and compassionate with those around us. Perhaps one way to accomplish that is by following what David Foster Wallace suggested once when he said that instead of cursing every person on the highway while stuck in traffic, we should try to imagine that some of them may be rushing to the hospital with a sick child. And instead of being annoyed by the lady with a grumpy face at the supermarket line, we may try to contemplate the possibility of that woman going through a rough couple of nights while holding the hand of her dying husband. For Wallace, if you really learn how to pay attention, or in our context, if you really learn how to see the world with a bit of perspective, then you will know that there are other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer health type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred. On fire with the same force that made the stars: love, fellowship, and the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Perspective, as the Stoic philosophers used to say, is about recognizing what is under our control and what is beyond our control. Perspective is about learning how to cope with the idea that we may not be the sole masters of our destinies, and that we shouldn't get too angry with the world or with ourselves because of the things that we cannot possibly change. And yet, at the same time, we also need to understand that we have always plenty of leeway to make a significant difference in our midst. So, for example, even if we didn't decide to bring this pandemic upon ourselves, we can still choose to act responsibly, wearing a mask in public when surrounded by people. And even if we did not create the conditions that allowed for systemic racism to flourish in our country, we can still decide to raise our voices and to work on a daily basis on behalf of a more equitable, just, and inclusive society for everyone. And even if we cannot change right away the rules and regulations that we have in this country to choose our elected officials, we can still engage in the sacred act of voting in these upcoming elections, because we believe in a strong and vibrant democracy for all. So, not everything is under our control. And yet, some of our actions can still make a huge difference in this aching world. To patience and perspective, we have to add a third P word, antidote, and that is positive attitude. Because if Viktor Frankl was right, and the last of our freedoms is in choosing our attitude when responding to what life is throwing our way, then we should do our best to face the world with what the Mishnah calls in our sources sever panim yafot, or in English, a pleasant countenance. In their book Switch, brothers Dan and Chip Heath quote from a study that analyzed 558 emotion words in English and found that 62% of them were negative emotions. Reflecting on those results, they write the following. According to an old urban legend, Eskimos have 100 different words for snow. Well, it turns out that negative emotions are our snow. It doesn't come as a surprise that when we are under a ton of stress, those negative emotions tend to come to the surface and take control of who we are. It doesn't come as a surprise either that those negative emotions can take a toll not only on our own health, but also on the well-being of those around us. We are all treading on very thin ice here. But the solution is not in allowing the worst in us to take the lead and to dictate the conditions of how we live our lives. On the contrary, we have to double down on training our best traits. We all want to feel appreciated and heard. We all want to be part of the solution and not of the problem. And for that to happen, we all need to spend more time focusing our attention in replicating the bright spots that are working, instead of relentlessly pointing out the weak links that we may find along the way. We have to transform the words of complaint into words of encouragement, the hours of criticism into hours of activism, and the moments of despair into opportunities for hope. It shouldn't be that hard, and I truly believe that we can do it. So finally, after patience, perspective, and a positive attitude, we cannot part ways without mentioning the final P word antidote for this day, and that is the word partnership. And by that I mean the central core principle of reaching out to others as we try to get out of this mess together. There is an African proverb that says that if we want to go fast, we should go alone, but if we want to go far, then we should try to go together. For the last 200 years, we have been exposed to the narrative of the self-made man or woman, to the idea that every person should be for him or herself first, and to the notion that only the fittest will survive. We have been taught that we are first and foremost individuals in pursuit not only of happiness, but mainly of self-determination. But the problem with all these ideas is that they have also been responsible for the spike, for the massive increase in the loneliness and the hopelessness that so many of us are feeling all over the Western world. As the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy says, just as hunger and thirst are our bodies' ways of telling us that we need to eat and drink, loneliness is the natural signal that reminds us when we need to connect with other people. However, once loneliness becomes a chronic condition, connecting with others doesn't come easy to us. We become more and more fearful, we avoid contact, and we retreat. And yet, that is when we need to dig deeper. Because as social neuroscientist John Cacioppo writes, the most difficult conceptual hurdle for people in the throes of loneliness is that although they are going through something that feels like a hole in the center of their being, a hunger that needs to be fed, this hunger can never be satisfied by a focus on eating. What is required is to step outside the pain of our own situation long enough to feed others. And that is how we get to fight some of the sorrows of this nasty pandemic. We have to feed others, literally and metaphorically as well. We have to invest in what journalist Johann Hari calls sympathetic joy, while breaking the addiction that we have to our own selves. More than ever, we have to be there for those who need it the most, because that is how we do tikkun olam. That is how we repair this broken world, and that is how we engage in what Judaism likes to call gmilut chasadim, or acts of loving kindness. It is through the performance of these gracious deeds that we may be able to find the strength and the resilience that we need in order to weather this current storm. So, we may still have to remain physically apart for an extra couple of months, and that is going to continue to be tough. But that doesn't mean that we should stop caring about everyone else. On the contrary, we have to reach out to those who are struggling and in pain, because even in the midst of chaos, we can build what Rebecca Solnit calls a paradise in hell. Why? Because as she says, when the loss is general, one is not cast out by suffering, but finds fellowship in it. That is the power of meaningful partnerships in times like ours. But for that to work, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to trust that we can bring some healing to the world. And we have to be willing to rise to the occasion. So, these are the 4 P-word antidotes that I wanted to share with you today as possible cures to some of our fears and anxieties. As you can see, each and every one of them requires a bit of homework, but I hope that you will agree with me when I say that the potential results are worth the effort. And yet, for those of you who may find the word too hard, for those of you who may feel as if your stamina is running super low, you know what? That's fine too. I don't want you to feel guilty or pressure to go beyond what you can do right now, since I am sure that your plate is pretty full as it is. So instead, I want you to remember the old story about the ring that King Solomon used to wear. The ring was so special that when things were going great, King Solomon would look at it and stay sober. And when things were going really south, he would look at the ring and find some peace of mind as well. According to the legend, engraved on that ring, King Solomon had written the words, Gam ze ya'avor. These too shall pass. As we continue to hope for the virus to go away, and for a successful vaccine to be massively produced in the upcoming months, may God inscribe us all in the book of life. May God bless us all with plenty of patience, perspective, positive attitude, and wonderful partnerships in the year ahead of us. And may God grant us all plenty of health, plenty of healing, and meaningful moments with those we love and care about. Leshana Tova Tikatevu, and Shabbat Shalom.